from Tech TV, welcome to Panorama. I'm your hostess, Ghada Hamadani. He has a bachelor degree in political science, a master in defense studies concurrent with completing the Joint Command and Staff program, and is a graduate of the Royal College of Defense Studies in London, UK. He has almost 5,000 hours of flight time in the C-130 family of aircraft, and is looking forward to breaking 10,000 hours of PowerPoint time. From June 18th to May 19th, he was honored to command Joint Task Force Impact, responsible for the Canadian Armed Forces Counter-Daesh mission in the Middle East. Without further ado, I would like to welcome our very special guest today, the former commanding officer for Operating Impact, BGen Colin. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here with us today. Could you please tell us a little bit about your family background?
I grew up on a farm in Alberta, just north of Calgary. One sister, two brothers, very tight family. There were only 6 years between the four of us. And it was a great upbringing, but at a very, very early age, I knew that it was aviation for me, not the farm, which is why I ended up in the Air Force. Yeah.
So what made you think of that?
Honestly, it was when my youngest brother was born. I was 5, and my uncle, my mom's brother, was a pilot, and we were going to go stay with my grandparents while my youngest brother was being born. And to get to my grandparents' place, my uncle and my grandfather flew up in an airplane to pick us up where we were. And on the way back to where my grandparents lived, I got to sit in the front with my uncle at the age of 5, and that sealed it. That was it. That's what I was going to do.
So, but you used military. It's like, I believe that was a civilian pilot?
It was. My uncle was a civilian pilot. I don't know. I was always attracted to the military in the sense that the military flies great airplanes. They do great missions, and I just... Plus, Top Gun came out the year I graduated from high school, so that was a defining influence in my life as well.
Okay,
yes.
Which is true, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, your wife was the first in the family to obtain a pilot's license.
Yes.
Does she fly? Like, can you
So
tell
she
us?
doesn't. She no longer flies, and that's actually where I met my wife. Was in Air Cadets.
Okay.
I was an Air Cadet and she was an Air Cadet. We were high school sweethearts. So she got selected to go to her private pilot's license with Air Cadets, and therefore got her pilot's license before I did. I didn't start flying airplanes until I got into the Air Force later. So I did my glider's license with Air Cadets, but she was the first one that had a pilot's license.
So do you have children?
We do. We have 2 children. Our daughter is 20 and just finished her 2nd year out at UBC in Vancouver. And our son is, he'll turn 18 this summer and is about to graduate from high school and off to university in the fall.
Okay. Are they planning to join military?
Our daughter is very clear, no.
Okay.
No, she does not want to do that at all. Our son, I think he would really like to be a pilot in the Air Force as well.
Well, you've been deployed, extensively outside Canada, right, and several missions. How would that affect your family and, it's like the children?
Yeah, it's very hard. I think, I mean, we could say they adjust. In hindsight, I'm not sure it's always fair to ask them to adjust. It is absolutely hard on the family. It's easier for me or any of us that deploy than it is for the family because we go to wherever it is we're going to do our job. And by the family not being there, we become very focused on that job.
That's right.
We don't have to worry about all those other things that, in this case, my wife had to worry about at home, like the washing machine breaking down, or the garage door opener not working, or our son, and school, all those things that she had to deal with. So she had to run a family by herself, and I think that was infinitely harder on her than it was me.
Okay. You've been always outside Canada, like serving in missions, or there was some time where you're here?
Yeah, no, even in Canada, I mean, as a member of the military, you'll get sent away on a course for a couple of months somewhere in Canada, so you're separated from the family, or you're traveling on the road with work, so you're separated from the family. My first probably 10, 12 years in the military, I was probably away from home 160, 180 days of the year just because of what I was doing. So, I mean, I'd like to think they've become more resilient because of it. I don't know. Time will tell. I mean, they grew accustomed to the life, and they knew what the life was, and I think they're okay with it. It's a question of, was it too much or not? But they'll be the ones that would that will decide that.
Would you encourage, new generation to join the military?
I think it's a great career. I really do. I think it's a great opportunity, even if it's not a career, even if it's only for 3 years or 5 years. I think it's a great way. It's a great way to put service before self and serve your nation and learn some great skills, and not just learn some great skills, but do some great things in some really neat parts of the world.
Where are some of the parts you served, and it's like worldwide?
So I've been pretty much, if you were to map out since 1991, when I joined the Air Force, where the Canadian Armed Forces has been involved, it would be pretty much all of those places. So I remember my career started with flying significant missions in and out of the former Yugoslavia, Haiti. There were some missions in Africa, Afghanistan, again Africa, down in Djibouti, places like that, Iraq, and Sudan. I spent 6 months in Sudan working with the African Union, and then back in Iraq again. So it has, if you were to see my resume, it would probably look very similar to just about any other members of the Canadian Armed Forces resume that's been in the Armed Forces as long as I have, because we generally all tend to go to the same place at the same time.
Yeah, but there is big difference between what you used to do and, at certain point, it's like Canadian were always peacemaker, right? But at some point you participate in some offensive, the Canadian Army.
So I would challenge that statement.
Oh, okay.
I think that Canadians, yes, did peacekeeping, and we still do peacekeeping, but we've also always done several other things. I think it's important to remember that while we were heavily involved in peacekeeping in, for example, the 70s and the 80s, we also had a full brigade on high readiness in Europe that was ready to do combat operations against the Soviet Union. So I think we need to keep that in mind, that the Canadian Armed Forces has always been about, in the end, it is always about peace. It's just the different means by which you achieve peace. And so I think because the Cold War and what Canada was doing in Europe at the time didn't involve combat, thank goodness, it allowed us to do peacekeeping at the same time. And now I think what you see is a world that is a little grayer. It's not as black and white as it was back then. So what you see is you see the Canadian Armed Forces involved in several smaller conflicts, in some cases trying to make peace as compared to just keep the peace, because in these places there's no peace to keep yet.
As former commander in the Canadian military, what do you believe are some of the key qualities of good leadership?
So to me, the first quality of good leadership is that it must be selfless. It can't be about the leader. It must be about the followers. It must be about those you serve, whether that be the nation or the partner nation, for example, in Iraq, and working with them. And it must be motivating, and it must be inspiring. It can't be negative leadership. So what I mean by that is that leadership at the end of the day to me is all about action, not position. It's not about the title. It's about doing what needs to be done. And the way you do that is you must motivate and inspire those around you to be better than they are or they thought they were, and to get them to do things that they might not necessarily want to do. And so while you can order them to do that, my experience has generally been that that's not nearly as effective as figuring out how to convince them that it's the right thing to do, and then they want to do it. There's a big difference.
Okay, is there a special technique you use to convince your team to do what you want them to do?
First, a key component is they must understand the mission. They must understand what it is we're trying to accomplish on the mission in terms of what is the end state, what is the goal, what are we working towards. And then once they understand that, and it's constantly reinforcing that with them. For example, in Iraq, in what we were doing in the Middle East, my message to them was always the same. It was about building partner capacity in the nations we were working in, to allow them to be able to ensure their security so that they didn't need our help anymore and we could go home. That's an incredibly motivating goal. So it's about defining a goal and then using multiple different methods to try and get them to that point. And really, to me, it's about empowering them. It's about explaining to them what you want done without telling them how to do it. And if you let them go, they will always amaze you with the results. Yes.
Okay. So how would you characterize Canada's current military role in the Middle East?
So I think Canada's current military role in the Middle East is in many ways similar to what it always has been. If we think back to when we got started in the Middle East from the Canadian Armed Forces perspective, really you could say that that might be the Suez Crisis of 1956 when we were part of the first peacekeeping force created by the United Nations. I think it's always been about that. It's always been about, and it remains about, providing assistance, providing resources to the various nations and the various people that seek to do things in that region in a way that promotes security and prosperity and stability. And it subscribes to the broader rules-based international order in terms of, the international structures, the United Nations, things like that. And I think we have a benefit or a strength as a nation like Canada because we're a middle power. We don't necessarily come in there with an agenda. We're not trying to impose our way upon them. It's truly about trying to figure out what they need and then figuring out how to get it for them.
Okay, what was your last mission about in Iraq?
So my last mission in Iraq, as you stated at the beginning, it was Canada's and remains Canada's contribution to the counter-Daesh mission. So, there's a large coalition, 74 nations, 5 international partners, that's working across the Levant from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf to defeat extremism. And then within that is a military coalition, which the Canadian Armed Forces are a part of. And then you have other people in there as well. For example, you have the NATO mission in Iraq, which is also commanded by a Canadian. So it was about all of us working together to defeat Daesh or ISIS. And initially, defeating Daesh was about a military campaign in terms of, helping to remove their means to harm or take over additional parts of Iraq. Now it's changed. The mission now is very much about what we call building partner capacity. So it's about giving in Iraq, the Iraqi security forces, the means to deliver on security within their own borders in a way that is compliant with the law of armed conflict, human rights, all those things that we aspire to as people, not just Canadians. And it's done in a way that front and center, it is always about them. It's by, with, and through them. It's not about us. So the mission has really, really changed from that hard military mission of, dropping bombs to now one of very much training and advising and mentoring the Iraqi security forces and the Lebanese security forces and the Jordanian security forces so that they can secure their own countries and hopefully give themselves time and space to allow the governments, particularly in Iraq, to start sorting out the other things that absolutely need to get sorted out in terms of representation, distribution of resources, all those things that probably weren't very well done in the past and which led to the rise of an extremist organization like Daesh in the first place.
So how long do you think this mission is going to take place there?
You've asked me when the Middle East is going to get solved.
That's true.
I don't know. I mean, the current mandate right now from the Government of Canada for this mission is until the end of March 2021. There will definitely be work until then. I think it's likely there will be work that needs to be done after that point in time, but that will be a decision by government in terms of whether or not we stay involved, and if we do stay involved, how we stay involved, certainly based on military advice. But I think right now what's really important to emphasize is that Iraq is now at a point where the military is not the solution. It's politics that is the solution. It's sorting out things like corruption and governance. It's distribution of resources. It's making sure the water is actually flowing in Basra so they have drinkable water. It's all those things now. And the military can only do so much in that space. All we can really do now in Iraq, and partnering with our Iraqi security forces, which are doing the bulk of the work, is the Iraqi security forces now, they can hold the ground. All right, they can ensure that Daesh doesn't create another caliphate. And that will hopefully give time and space to the government of Iraq to do all those other things that need to start happening now.
So what's the role of the Iraqi army, and how do you screen its leaders and soldiers being trained by the Canadian Armed Forces members?
So that's a great question. And I think to answer that question, the first thing I need to point out is that it was the Iraqi army and the Iraqi security forces that liberated Iraq. It was not the coalition. The coalition was there to assist the Iraqis. So Mosul, Raqqa, all those places, they were liberated by the Iraqis, not by the coalition. And so initially the training consisted of giving them basic skills so that they could actually go and they could liberate Mosul and all those other places that have now freed Iraq largely of Daesh. The training has now evolved into very much, I would characterize it as being training oriented to increasing the professionalization of the Iraqi army. So we're talking, you know, colleges or senior schools or senior leadership training, things like that. More of a mentoring and advising role as compared to actually training individual soldiers. Now, the individual soldiers we do train, they are screened. They're screened by the coalition and several of our partners. And there's multiple different screening that takes place to ensure that the people we bring into the training, to the level that we can, and I will readily admit it's not perfect, but we work really, really hard at it, and we're constantly reevaluating how that is done. That screening, it looks at things like human rights violations, law of armed conflict violations, criminal activity, things like that. And there's multiple agencies involved in that screening to ensure, to the best of our ability, that the people we're training are people who are actually going to use the training we've given them for the right things.
What a typical day for you was when you were in Iraq, when you were serving?
Yeah, so it was always the same. I mean, it would start out the same way in terms of going into the email and checking the traffic from Ottawa, which is separated by 7 hours, because when I was going to bed, they were generating things for me to do the next day. So it would always start with that. And then usually there would be some sort of update brief in terms of what's happened in the last 24 hours and what we see happening in the next 24 hours, where I can just get my situational awareness as a commander and provide very, very short direction and guidance. I mean, at the end of the day, these people are out there doing their job. They don't need me in their shorts all the time. So unless they need help, it was something we didn't really talk about that much. They had an operation to conduct, and my job was to enable them. It wasn't to tell them how to do it. And then, you know, other things, multiple things. As a senior Canadian commander in the theater, I had multiple engagements with our coalition partners, our allies, our regional allies in terms of, you know, Kuwait and Iraq and Lebanon and Jordan. I was interacting with them all the time. I had regular meetings with our Canadian ambassadors in the region, you know, to sort out the Canadian approach to what we were doing in the region. So I would characterize most of my time in theater as being about being the face of Canada and the Canadian military in the region, and ensuring that I was talking to as many people as possible involved in trying to do the same thing to make sure we weren't stepping on each other's toes.
Okay, so what do you think of the future of Iraq?
So Iraq is at I think Iraq is at a crossroads right now. I think Iraq has gone through some pretty tough stuff. I think their low point was probably 2014, where they just about lost their country to Daesh. They've liberated their country from Daesh now, and now they're at a point where I think they need to decide what next. They know what they don't want. Now I think they need to start deciding on what they do want. And it is truly about the government of Iraq working with the Iraqi citizens, all Iraqi citizens, regardless of religion or ethnicity, and figuring out how to address the fundamental grievances that gave rise to an organization like Daesh in the first place, in terms of distribution of resources or poverty, all these things that make people feel disattached from that society. These are the things they've got to deal with now. So I would characterize Iraq right now as, I see opportunity, I see potential, and now it's up to them.
So do you think the current government, they're taking serious steps towards building the country?
So in some areas, yes. All right. In other words, in other areas, I think they still need some work. There's still things that need to get done. I think they're still learning in many ways. Let's not forget that a large portion of the Iraqi government are new to governing. So they have a learning process to go through as well. But again, that's where that coalition comes in that, you know, for example, our ambassador in Iraq works very, very closely with the Iraqi government on figuring out how to devolve more power to the provinces away from the central government in Baghdad, things like that. So it's a broad effort to help Iraqis work through these problems while the military holds the ground to give them that time and space. I see positives. I see opportunities. There's no doubt there are challenges, but if they seize these opportunities, it can keep going in the right direction.
So how is the women involvement in the mission there? So
that's a great question. I'm glad you asked that question, because I'll speak to op impact first. Generally, as a rule, because I kind of tried to keep track of this, just because I was curious as well. Generally, as a rule, about 16 or 17% of the people I had with me, working for me, were female in the Canadian Armed Forces. But what was really, really interesting about it was that we are using that, and we're actually working with some of our partners in the Middle East to expand the female population in their own militaries. So, for example, in Jordan, we have 2 Canadian Armed Forces female members working with the first ever female combat arms platoon in the Jordanian Armed Forces. All females, which is fascinating. And the platoon commander in the Jordanian Army that is in charge of this is the first ever female graduate from Jordan, from Sandhurst in England. So an exceptional individual. So it was really, really interesting to be a part of that. A, to be around those Canadian women working with them because they were incredibly motivated. But even more so to be around the Jordanian women because they were just so, they knew they were trailblazers. They knew they were at the front of something that has significant potential in terms of, you know, using the other half of your population and you know, and getting them involved in civil society and all these things like this. My honest impression of it was that I don't think the Jordanians fully appreciate the genie they've let out of the bottle. You know, there's more to come.
Yeah.
And so that was to me, that's an example of one of those opportunities and bright spots I see in what is absolutely, you know, an uncertain and challenging environment. But there are elements there that all of these things, if you look at them in and of themselves, you go, well, it's not much. But I think when you start to knit it all together, including this female aspect, I think you start to see real elements for positive change in the right direction.
Well, we've seen on the media, actually, the Kurdish women fighting ISIS.
Yes.
So have you, you know, like cooperated with them? Have they get, you know, some help from you guys, or they did it by their own?
So our policy is that we work with all Iraqis, regardless of ethnicity or religion, who want to build a stable, secure, prosperous Iraq within the current borders of Iraq. So that would include the Kurds. So we absolutely saw, for example, the Kurdish forces and the Iraqi forces, and yes, females in the Kurdish forces. We saw them working together in areas like the Hamran Mountains to press Daesh. So it's fascinating to see it. And we know even in our own history here in Canada that, you know, the emergence of the female population in Canada as an equal partner in society really started in many ways during the First World War, when all the men went to the front and the women had to be put into the factories. And because they were working in the factories, you know, that created a desire for equal rights and equal opportunity, which then it kept going to where we are today. So again, you know, that gender diversity question, I think, is a really, really good question, and it's another element by which I think the government of Iraq taps into the opportunities. You know, there are some incredibly educated and motivated female Iraqis that want to make a difference, and if they're given that opportunity, I think they can make that difference.
So you encourage women to join military?
I think anybody, if someone wants to join the military, they, by all means. Certainly, my perspective is I can't see a difference, honestly. Male or female in the military, to me, it matters not. You know, are they competent? Are they motivated? Do they want to make a difference? That should be the only criteria. Yes.
During your service, were there some fun incidents happening while you were in the mission?
Yeah, the things I look back on fondly are, it's always the same thing. It's about the people. You know, whether that be the men and women I worked with in Canadian uniform, or even the opportunity to interact with, you know, the Iraqis or the Jordanians or things like that. I mean, I did some fantastic things. I went downhill skiing in Lebanon, which I never ever would have thought even existed. But because of what we're doing in Lebanon with the Jordanian military and teaching them how to do winter warfare up in their mountains where they get 6 to 8 meters of snow a year, the one area we were teaching them had a ski hill, so we actually went skiing for the day. So really, really, I mean, I tell everyone now that I've gone downhill skiing in Lebanon, which is amazing. You know, I got to swim in the Dead Sea. We went to Petra. We spent a night in the desert with the Bedouins. I mean, fantastic things that were eye-opening and gave me a completely different perspective on the region.
Would you like to go back there?
Yes, I would. I would, honestly. A, to see how it's going. B, you could spend a lifetime in there, in that part of the world, and still not fully comprehend or understand the sense of history and the longevity of that region and all the things that it has gone through, the highs and the lows. I mean, Iraq, I mean, this is a part of the world that gave us agriculture, it gave us the wheel, cursive script, astronomy, mathematics, the modern city. I mean, this was all developed right there in, what is the breadbasket of the world, the middle between the Euphrates and the Tigris. So it's just that sense of history and that part of recognizing that there's something bigger in all of this. It's not just about me. And I think in many ways that's what I was most impressed with many of the Iraqis that I dealt with, was that sense of belonging to something that is bigger than themselves, and that sense of history and that tie to the land that, in some ways I think Canada is still developing that because we're a relatively young nation.
What are your plans for the future?
My plans for the future, I'm just about to come off leave and off of this, and then I'll go on to the Air Staff in Ottawa, the headquarters of the Air Force, where I'll be responsible for Air Force procurement, an easy file.
Okay. Comparing to what you've been doing.
Yes.
Right?
No. I mean, it's a different battle. It's a different, it's process, and it's accountability, and it's budgets, and it's much different than what I did overseas. Yes.
So how do you see yourself doing that?
So, I mean, I'll enjoy it for different reasons. I think if you've been in the organization long enough and you've worked in project management and contracting and procurement before, as long as you understand how the system works, for the most part, it becomes easier to understand when things aren't moving as quickly as you would like them to move. Because there are legitimate reasons. Most of my military career has been spent in nations or parts of the world where governments were able to act too quickly. They were able to make changes that were too big. It's that compromise and consensus in the middle that keeps a country stable. So while I sometimes personally find it frustrating that I can't move things as quickly as I would like through the government systems, I also recognize that it is a defining characteristic of what makes Canada a stable nation. And as a member of the Armed Forces, well, I'm absolutely all about that. And the bonus part of it is that I'll be home every night and every weekend. So
that's true.
It's a good trait.
Yeah. Anything else you'd like to add?
No, the only thing I would add was thank you sincerely for giving me the opportunity to talk to you and talk about what these men and women are doing in a fascinating part of the world. In my opinion, they're doing it for the right reasons, with the best of intentions. And if there's one thing I would pass, it's that I don't think it's talked about enough in terms of what Canada is doing in the Middle East through Op Impact and our other missions in the Middle East. And this is an opportunity for me as their former commander to sit in front of you and your audience and tell them, listen, they're working out there. They're doing great work, and you should be very, very proud of them. And I think I always use my father as the litmus test on this, back in Alberta, if he tells me on the phone when I'm deployed that the guys he has coffee with in the coffee shop in the morning haven't heard about me and don't know what I'm doing, well, then we as Canadians aren't doing a very good job telling Canadians what we're doing in the world. And I think this is a great opportunity to make that case.
Well, thank you very much for being with us today, and wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Thank
you very much.
Thank you. And up until next time, have a good night.